all who come to this happy podcast, welcome. Welcome to This Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And welcome to the series where I will be reviewing all 63 Disney animated films in chronological order. We are on number 3, which means the next movie up is Fantasia. Largely considered to be the largest experimental film ever produced, Fantasia is told through animated segments paired to pieces of classical music. Fantasia doesn't have a plotline that goes throughout the entire movie, rather, each of these segments has a story in its own right. Fantasia demonstrates Disney's mastery when it comes to pairing sight with sound. On the surface, the idea of a movie that was created by first picking out a piece of classical music and then building a story on top of that might seem kind of odd and random for Disney. It is not random, though, when you learn that Walt had a big passion for classical music. In fact, it may have been his biggest passion. In 1986, Walt's wife Lillian offered the city of Los Angeles tens of millions of dollars to build a concert hall in the name of Walt. Lillian said, quote, "I have always had a deep love and admiration for my husband, and I wanted to find a way to honor him, as well as give something to Los Angeles which would have lasting qualities. The thought that a concert hall would be built that would entertain the public with the finest musical offerings would be enormously gratifying to him." End quote. Originally, Fantasia was not going to be a full-length feature film. In fact, the origins of Fantasia started off as just one singular short rather than a feature full of them. This singular short that would later provide the gateway to make Fantasia was called The Sorcerer's Apprentice, inspired by the piece of classical music of the same name written by composer Paul Dukas. The main character of this short was going to be Mickey Mouse. It seems like a no-brainer to have Mickey Mouse be the main character of this short, but in reality the decision to have Mickey as the main character was much more strategic than it was obvious. Believe it or not, people were losing interest in Mickey, but more specifically, the Disney animators. The animators had more fun with characters like Goofy, but especially Donald Duck. For Donald was a character that got into a lot of mayhem, and nothing really worked out perfectly for Donald. Donald was a rage monster, and in the views of the animators, that was a lot more interesting to animate when compared to animating Mickey. In order to make it so Mickey wasn't ever going to be treated as second class, Walt wanted to come up with an animated short where it was in fact Mickey that got into trouble. And then the idea of Sorcerer's Apprentice was born. As the story goes, Walt was eating dinner at a place in Los Angeles called Chasen's Restaurant. I'm pretty sure it's Chasen's, but a place that was known for frequently serving Hollywood's elite. While Walt was eating, he saw the face of composer Leopold Stokowski. We're going to go with Stokowski. That name might not mean anything to us today, but back then Stokowski was a household name. Back then, music composers held a different weight with the general public than they do today. Walt described his idea of essentially adapting a piece of music to an animated feature, and Stokowski loved this idea so much that he jokingly offered to do the score for free, citing the fact that it had always been a dream of his to set a piece of classical music to animation. A partnership was born that night at Chasen's Restaurant. Pretty quickly after that, Stokowski got to work composing his arrangement for The Sorcerer's Apprentice. In order to record the score, they actually had to rent out a studio stage because the typical sound stage was too small for the 85-piece orchestra. They recorded the score for The Sorcerer's Apprentice in the beginning hours of the morning between 1 and 3 a.m. because Stokowski said the players would be more alert in the hours since they would be depending on coffee. That seems crazy to me, but I guess we shouldn't doubt Stokowski's genius. Either right before or after recording was done for The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Stokowski actually came to Walt and mentioned that this idea of setting classical music to animation is too big for just one short, and tried to convince Walt that they should think about adapting more pieces of music. It didn't take much to convince Walt, and he ran off with this idea. The movies that were in production at this time were Pinocchio and Bambi, and those movies were taking more effort and were more difficult than Walt ever imagined. So, for lack of a better term, Walt basically abandoned the Pinocchio and Bambi to work on his true passion project at the time, Fantasia, or as it was called in this point in development, the band concert. Like I briefly mentioned before, Walt was a big supporter and fan of classical music, and he wanted to share his passion of classical music to the public. Walt wanted to change the mentality of the public when they say things like, "I don't like classical music because I just don't get it or understand it," or "Classical music is often played in places where I just choose not to go." Walt said, quote, "There is a lot of people who would like classical music, but don't like going to the opera. Let's make classical music exciting," end quote. Walt also said on numerous occasions that if people could visually see the music while listening to it, they would understand it better. So, Walt and Stokowski now had this idea of making a full-length feature film using pieces of classical music. The next step was to select what pieces of music to use. Walt needed to secure rights to some pieces of classical music, and to do that, Stokowski made a trip to Europe to meet with relatives of composers to secure those rights. And no joke, this was treated as almost an undercover spy operation, at least that's how I like to think of it, because Stokowski actually wrote Walt in secret code on this trip to give Walt updates. When Stokowski got back the following month of September 1938, Walt, Stokowski, and Deems Taylor, who was a music critic and music promoter who has also been helping with this project, sat down in a room for the better part of a month and did nothing except listen to pieces of classical music. They eventually got the pieces that we see in Fantasia today. Even though Fantasia didn't have one storyline, each section was still treated with a lot of care when it came to the story they wanted to depict for each musical piece. These meetings were a lot less stressful for Walt, as Stokowski and Taylor led some of these story meetings. Walt felt like he was breaking ground again in the world of animation by not having a narrative flow for a feature film. But the narrative or the lack thereof would not be the most unusual thing about Fantasia. Walt remembered seeing a movie called Audioscopics, a 3D movie in the 1930s. That inspired Walt to make Fantasia a theatrical experience. For example, he wanted to do things like pump scents throughout the theater to heighten the experience. But most notably, Walt wanted to develop a new sound system for the theaters. This sound system would have speakers not only on the side of the theaters, but in the front, back, and even the center of the theater, allowing the audience to feel like they were in the center of the orchestra. This new sound system was called Fantasound. Fantasound was only able to be installed in a limited amount of theaters, and it was actually very expensive to install. It would cost around $85,000, which is close to about $1.3 million today, to install Fantasound into each theater that they wanted to. Since this was so costly, Fantasia only played in 12 theaters during its roadshow presentations. And when I mean roadshow, Fantasia didn't have a typical theatrical release, but it was presented as this roadshow. A roadshow meaning that you would have to buy tickets in the same way you would need to buy tickets for a concert. Buying them in advance, having assigned seats, and Disney even hired his own team to plan and supervise every aspect of the Fantasia experience in these theaters. From curtain cues and lighting and even ushers, theater staff was even trained to take each patron to their seat. Guests came wearing tuxedos and their best dress, much like they would if they were going to the opera. Programs were presented during each showing of Fantasia, and you would have to pay more than you would to see a Fantasia than if you were to see it at your typical neighborhood movie theater. But when people were going to go to Fantasia, it wasn't a movie they were going to, but a legit experience. This roadshow release of Fantasia was not a success financially. Newspapers didn't know if they should send their music critics or movie critics, but even if it wasn't successful financially, it still did decently well with the critics. But some reviews praised the movie, giving Walt the same sense of critical success as with Snow White and Pinocchio, but music critics who were purists about the music bashed on the film. Fantasia ran in New York and LA for a year and in San Francisco for 47 weeks. This is actually fantastic for a roadshow picture, and in those larger areas it was well received. Those who saw it absolutely loved it. The only problem, though, is that not a lot of people saw it. With this roadshow format of showcasing the film, it put a strong limitation on the amount of people who could actually watch the movie. It was only ever shown at 12 theaters, 16 at its highest point, and in each theater there was only 2 shows a day. That, mixed with the pure expense of installing Fantasound in theaters, made it so Fantasia was a box office disappointment for the studio. The more you look into it, it almost seemed that Fantasia was destined to fail. Disney's typical film distributor was a company called RKO, who passed on Fantasia originally because of this whole roadshow idea. Eventually, Disney did allow RKO to start distributing Fantasia, and for a little bit, RKO did indeed still run it as a roadshow. But in 1942, the film was edited down by roughly 40 minutes, making it only about an hour and 20-minute film, and RKO distributed that cut of the film nationally in 1942. Walt wanted Fantasia to last in theaters forever. His dream was to have it as a perpetual entertainment feature. New shorts would be continually added so people would always want to be coming back. Before they realized how Fantasia was going to perform at the box office, they already started work on more shorts that they could add to it. Now, one of my favorite parts of revisiting these movies is actually looking at reviews from the year the movies came out. So let's go ahead and take a look at several. A composer by the name of Igor Stravinsky, who actually had one of his music pieces used in the film, said, "The order of the pieces had been shuffled, and the most difficult parts of them have been eliminated. It did not save the musical performance." Dorothy Thompson for the New York Herald said, "I left the theater in a condition bordering on a nervous breakdown. The film was a remarkable nightmare. It was cruel, brutal, brutalizing, and a caricature of the decline of the West." A Spanish newspaper said, "Fantasia is a strange hybrid that only represents the creator's delusions of grandeur." Sunday Times from the UK said, "Fantasia, in short, is Disney sometimes at his worst, often at his very best, and the best is on a level which no other cinematograph designer has reached." And Variety said, very simply, "There is something in Fantasia for every taste." Fantasia is an interesting movie to review. You can't really review it as a whole as it is comprised of individual shorts. So you'll just need to talk about each one, and I'll just need to talk about each one at a time. And here are my thoughts. After Fantasia, after I finished the movie and the credits started rolling, I got a feeling of confusion, and I don't really know where that feeling came from. It didn't feel like this movie had a target audience, and looking upon the film as a whole, it just feels like it lacks something. I think the most accurate review of the movie is the one I just read about, Fantasia feeling like the creator's delusions of grandeur. I feel like the target audience for this movie was Walt, and I almost feel like this is a case of Walt's ambition being his folly. There were some animated segments of this that I loved, but overall the film kind of just falls flat. Deems Taylor, who I mentioned previously helped with the production of this movie, is the one that helps explain to you what the music is about and what you're about to see. He starts off by saying that there are 3 types of music that they used in Fantasia. The first is music that has a definite story to it and what they animated correlated with that story. The second type was music, while not having a story, definitely makes you think of certain images. And the next is music that is music just for the sake of being music. The first short in Fantasia is that third type of music just for the sake of being music. What they are trying to go for with this first piece is to animate images and colors that your brain might imagine if you were listening to this piece in your typical orchestral auditorium. Like if you were listening to a piece of classical music, what was going on inside your head? It's a really abstract concept and one that really honestly makes me tilt my head in confusion just a little bit. But it actually kind of worked. You definitely are influenced by the abstractness of it all, but I do feel like they did a really good job at animating what was going on in my brain. They had the right colors, the right patterns, and it was all very imaginative. And surprisingly for me, my eyes were glued to the screen. Not because it was intriguing, but it was almost hypnotizing. It was done before I knew it, and I wish this portion just went on longer because I was just so relaxed while watching this, and sometimes you just need something that can help relax you. The next section of music is probably one of the most recognizable in the entire Fantasia. I mean, it was for me, for someone who is, for lack of a better term, illiterate when it comes to classical music. It was selected pieces from Tchaikovsky's The Nutcracker, the classic Christmas time ballet. And in this short, it's not an adaptation of that ballet, but it's still a ballet in some form of the word. Rather than animating people to do the dancing is being done by various plants and fairies. And for example, mushrooms were doing a dance here, bits of flowers were blown through the wind, and when they land, they take the form of a ballet dancer with a big tutu. In elementary school, I probably went on 3 separate field trips between like the 2nd and 6th grade to see performances of the Nutcracker, and each time I didn't enjoy it very much, and that's where I found that ballet is not really my thing, nor has it ever been my thing. So even though I was watching flowers dance, it was still a ballet, and I still wasn't enjoying myself watching this portion. Not saying you won't, but like I said, for me, ballet is just not my thing. The third short of this film is undoubtedly the most iconic short of all of Fantasia. It's the short that's on most of the posters, and that is The Sorcerer's Apprentice, starring Mickey Mouse. This is the short that most people attribute to Fantasia, and I have encountered several people that think Sorcerer Mickey is actually the entire film. Sorcerer Mickey has become one of, if not the most popular form of Mickey, and that got started in this very short. This music comes from a piece called Sorcerer's Apprentice and is one of those pieces where the music had a definite story to it, and they use that story for this short. Mickey, who is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, has a job of like transporting water from a fountain to what looks like a well, but when the sorcerer goes upstairs to take a rest, Mickey puts on the sorcerer's hat and conjures a spell to bring brooms to life to help him. Mickey forgets that he needs to stop the spell, so the brooms continue to fill the well and eventually flood the entire place. Mickey is charming, and of course he is. He's Mickey Mouse. It's also fun to see how they designed Mickey for this short, because they kind of had to reinvent him a little bit. If you look at earlier iterations of Mickey before the Sorcerer's Apprentice, you'll realize that his eyes are just like solid like pieces of black. Well, in this one, they gave Mickey pupils, which provided a wider range of emotion, as well as doing kind of a hard change on Mickey's body shape, which also was able to help allow them to animate a more interesting Mickey. It's fun. It's charming. You have to have this in either your top 1 or 2 favorite shorts or parts of Fantasia. The next segment is set to a piece of music called The Rite of Spring, and it tells a brief history of the world from the creation of the earth to the extinction of the dinosaurs. And for me, the main things to love about this short are the dinosaurs. When animating this sequence, there was a real focus on making sure that the dinosaurs looked real and not fantasized in any way, shape, or form, and I definitely feel like they nailed it. They animated dinosaurs with real fear in them, and the emotion was only heightened by how the rest of the scene was colored, with the lightning adding other layers of suspense, especially when the T-Rex is introduced. The T-Rex is introduced, and then the lightning shines or like makes a bright flash on this T-Rex, and it's like legitimate, like scary. You feel the terror that the T-Rex brings to the other dinosaurs around him. And when the T-Rex fights the Stegosaurus, it's kind of incredible how much you are rooting for the Stegosaurus, even if because it's just a dinosaur that hasn't spoken a single word. But I think that most of the credit is due to the fact with how effective they were at making the way you feel about the T-Rex. It was just scary, and they nailed it. This also provided the main source of inspiration for what's called the Primeval World, which most of you would probably recognize as the dinosaur segment on the Disneyland Railroad. There is also some really cool effects done with the lava sprouting from volcanoes or the lava bubbles that you see, but my favorite effect, maybe not the most flashy, is you see a simple crack in the earth, that when an earthquake happens, it opens up. I don't know what mesmerized me about this animation so much, but I rewound it and watched it like 2 or 3 times more. There's also another borderline heartbreaking scene in this. Dinosaurs get stuck in tar pits, and it's just kind of sad to watch. But the more I talk about this segment, the more I think it becomes one of my favorite segments in Fantasia. The next segment isn't really a segment, it's just Dean Taylor, who is the one who introduces all of the parts of the film, and he introduces us to the soundtrack, which is simply one vertical line. They make the soundtrack a character in the film. It's just one simple vertical line that goes from the bottom and top of your screen, and as the soundtrack, this line behaves almost as like a sound wave, like when you see like sound waves like visualized, and it's reacting and creating shapes to the sound. It's done very in similar fashion as the first short, but this was also kind of disguised kind of like an intermission point of the film. The next segment is the Pastoral Symphony. This part of Fantasia has probably drawn up the most controversy out of any of the other parts. I'll leave it up to you to go look up as to why, but for me, I skipped this particular part, so I can't speak to its merits or any of its negatives. Then this next segment after that is one called The Dance of the Hours, which on paper looks like something I wouldn't like at all because it's a piece of music that is commonly associated with a ballet. This piece usually depicts groups of dancers representing morning, day, evening, and night. And in this case, the dances are represented by ostriches for the morning, hippos for the day, elephants for the evening, and crocodiles for the night. They are definitely doing ballet, and at first with the ostriches, it's a strict ballet, but then as the hippos are introduced and then the elephants, it turns into something that's actually really humorous. The elephants prank one of the hippos by blowing bubbles that lift the chair that the hippo was sleeping on, and a bunch of other madness ensues. The crocodiles are introduced as the night dancers, and there's almost a dance battle between all the rest of the animals. I was honestly not expecting myself to laugh as much as I did, and it's very charming, and if you're like me who doesn't like ballet that much, I would still highly recommend watching this segment. The next segment has 2 pieces of distinct, very different types of conflicting music. But that was kind of the point they were going for. They wanted to really showcase good versus evil. The 2 pieces of music in this particular segment are The Night on Bald Mountain and Ave Maria. You might have heard of Ave Maria before, but maybe not The Night on Bald Mountain. As Dean Taylor tells us before this segment, Bald Mountain is a name that is commonly used in folklore and folk tales for the home of Satan or the devil. In this short, we have Chernabog, a demonic presence who rises from Bald Mountain, and through the touch of his shadow summons all types of restless souls, ghosts, and skeletons for a gathering at Bald Mountain. This gathering is ended by the sound of church bells, which makes Chernabog and his minions go back into hiding. This is when Ave Maria comes into play. The Ave Maria segment is just a processional of monks or other religious figures walking along a path. You never get a close-up of these figures, but this part actually may be one of the most ambitious shots in animated history. Filmed over 6 days with a crew of 9 men, the processional that you see is filmed with a big horizontal multiplane camera, and for more details of this camera, you can go listen to my Pinocchio episode. But it was set up across the whole length of the Disney soundstage, which was about 150 feet, meaning they had about 150 feet of painted animated planes used to help animate the moving processional. These 2 pieces of music couldn't have been more different from one another, and I wouldn't blame you if you skipped some of The Night on Bald Mountain like I did, especially if you don't like that specific imagery that is used. And that is Fantasia. Overall, it's a piece of animation that is a testament to Walt's desire to continually innovate more than anything else. I do feel like it lacks in having a cohesive narrative, which is obviously the point, but I think that just takes away from my overall enjoyment of the film. So out of the 3 Disney films that I have reviewed and talked about so far, Snow White, Pinocchio, and Fantasia, that's how I'd probably rank them in release date order. So Snow White 1, Pinocchio 2, Fantasia 3. And even though I don't like the second part of Pinocchio, that first half of Pinocchio is just so incredibly charming. I love it so much. I have to put that over Fantasia, where I didn't really have any similar emotional output than I did when compared to that first half of Pinocchio. Thank you for listening to this Happy Place, a Disney podcast. And remember, there is a great big beautiful tomorrow shining at the end of every day.